So, Robby, what's on your radar?
Remember May 13th, 2021? That was the day that the CDC gave us all some long overdue good news. The vaccines were remarkably effective at stopping transmission, hospitalization, and death due to COVID-19. Director Rochelle Walensky said the vaccine data was so promising that it no longer seemed necessary for vaccinated Americans to wear masks. And outdoor spread was so unlikely that no one needed to put on a mask to walk the dog or go for a run at all. We have all longed for this moment, said Walensky during a media briefing. And she was right. The news was a huge relief. Finally, there were circumstances where reasonably cautious people could safely throw away their masks and live their lives as normal once again. What we know now is that this declaration from the CDC made one specific group of people very furious. And I'm talking, of course, about teachers' unions. According to documents recently obtained and released by Fox News, the National Education Association, an influential union representing public school teachers and a major political supporter and funder of the Democratic Party, swiftly intervened to ensure that the CDC would still advise masking in schools, regardless of the situation with vaccines. The NEA threatened to release a letter excoriating the CDC's guidance. This prompted government health officials to clarify that masks should still be worn in all schools, regardless of the situation. Now, the NEA's meddling is actually unsurprising. Earlier this year, teachers' unions mounted a similar effort to persuade the Biden White House to slow down on school reopening. This is the role that teachers' unions have claimed for themselves throughout the pandemic: create obstacles to prevent children's lives from returning to normal for as long as possible. It's a role that American Federation of Teachers President Randi Weingarten clearly relishes. Her Twitter feed is filled with demands that students be masked, distanced, and quarantined as often as necessary. But here's the thing. Students don't need to wear masks. They just don't. There's scant evidence that putting kids in masks makes them any safer from the ill effects of COVID-19. New York Magazine's David Zweig reviewed 17 different studies cited by the CDC and found little reason to believe that masks were making a difference in schools at all. Better ventilation seemed to be the much more important mitigation strategy, and it's easier to do. Young people, after all, are at extremely low risk of suffering a negative health outcome associated with the coronavirus. COVID-19 has claimed the lives of fewer than 400 people under the age of 18, many of them with underlying health problems. For most kids, not all kids, but the overwhelming majority, COVID-19 does not pose a greater statistical risk than the flu. Masks just don't matter for them that much. Before the widespread availability of the vaccines, masks might have been important to prevent students from unwittingly spreading the disease to a vulnerable adult. But it's now trivially easy for school staff members to get the vaccine and reduce their risk of hospitalization and death to almost nothing. The students are overwhelmingly safe because they are young people, and the teachers and staff are also safe because they can get the vaccine. Schools can implement additional strategies for good measure, like opening the windows and having lunch outside, weather permitting. Masks are much more trouble, especially if kids are expected to wear them until some distant point in the future, possibly never, when COVID-19 is gone completely. The negatives are not zero, especially for young children. Lloyd Fisher, the president of the Massachusetts chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics, told New York Magazine. It is important for children to see facial expressions of their peers and the adults around them in order to learn social cues and understand how to read emotions. Quote, some pundits on the right have dubiously claimed that masks are harmful for students' physical health, making it difficult for them to breathe or more likely to catch other illnesses. And there just isn't any evidence of that. I don't claim that wearing masks is a huge or insurmountable burden, but they do inhibit communication. For young people who have trouble reading social cues, fitting in with their peers, or difficulty hearing, masks are definitely a negative. It's one thing to require them when lives are on the line, but if they're not making a big positive difference, and all available evidence suggests that they're having a minimal impact on the spread of COVID-19 in schools, then the case for forcing kids to wear them all day long indefinitely is extremely weak. Yet Weingarten and company act as if it would be insane to reopen a school without a mask mandate, and have lashed out at Republican officials like Florida Governor Ron DeSantis for prohibiting such requirements. But the U.S. is somewhat alone in its zeal for placing masks on school children. As the New York Times recently conceded, most students and teachers in the UK do not wear masks at all. And the situation is much the same in Ireland, France, Italy, and Switzerland. Teachers' unions and their allies must have missed this memo. Indeed, former Education Secretary Arne Duncan implicitly suggested that DeSantis had blood on his hands following the deaths of more than a dozen Florida educators from COVID-19. Now, these deaths are tragic. But it is simply not true that a lack of mask mandates is killing Florida teachers. What's killing Florida teachers and everyone else who suffers a negative health outcome due to COVID-19 is a lack of vaccination. Of the 15 who passed away, at least 13 were unvaccinated. Information for the other 2 was not immediately available, though it's likely they were unvaccinated as well. Now, it's reasonable to criticize DeSantis for his efforts to prevent public institutions from requiring employees to get vaccinated, but the lack of mask mandates has largely taken center stage. The Federal Drug Administration should move much faster to approve vaccines for young kids so that families have the option, just the option, of additional over-the-top protection. But there's no compelling reason to make students experience further hardships while we wait for that day to come. Teachers union leaders often claim that their organization protects not just the interest of public employees, the teachers, but students and their families as well. If they really mean that, they should drop their enthusiasm for mask mandates. Any day now, please. So, it's just a fact of the pandemic that teachers unions have done a lot of work to require we need mitigation, we need masks, they were the biggest proponents of virtual schooling. And, we're in a different phase of the pandemic. I can't imagine, making children's lives this difficult for like a second year in a row. But that's kind of what we're facing in some places. And the data, I keep looking at it, it just doesn't support needing them to do this. And so I think it would be reasonable to kind of drop that opposition, be as pro-vaccination for employees as you want. But mask seems to be the focus. And what do you think, Kim?
Well, I'm actually curious what Ryan thinks, because he's the one that has the kids.
Yes, I think this is a really important debate to be having, an important conversation to be having, and one that we've had real difficulty having in a serious way among people in good faith, because I do think that you have to weigh the costs and benefits. Obviously there are benefits to wearing masks for children who are indoors, but there are serious costs that come with that too. And so if you weigh those costs and they turn out to be greater than the benefits, that is something that people have to actually grapple with. And I do think people can go too far in extrapolating from their own experience. My kids happen to handle masks just fine. Like it's bizarre. Like they leave school and they continue walking with the mask. Like if I were them, I'd be ripping the thing off right. As soon as I came out of the door, they would wear it all the way home. And one of my kids will wear it even like until you say like, hey, you can take this thing off. Like we're like halfway home. Like it's okay. But that's just them. And so I don't want to extrapolate to right. all kids, because like Robby said, social cues are really important for some of the youngest kids and for other kids who have learning disabilities. And for people who are 12 and older, they're vaccinated. And at the same time, the FDA is not showing the urgency to get vaccines to kids who are 11, 10, 9, 8. What is taking so long? Meanwhile, it is legal for a doctor to prescribe a vaccine to somebody under 12, and it's called an off-label. As long as now that the Pfizer vaccine is approved by the FDA, a doctor can legally prescribe it to a 10-year-old. It doesn't need to be approved for that 10-year-old. But the American Academy of Pediatrics has discouraged it, and so basically no doctors that I know of are willing to do it. And so they're willing to let them go to school unvaccinated, but this other conversation is just off limits. It's strange.
One thing I'm worried about is the social consequences of this, kind of like what you're mentioning, Ryan, that the kids seem like they've adjusted well to wearing masks, and they're even wearing them when they don't need to be wearing them. And, we're looking at a generation of kids that they spend all of their time online, looking at their phones or their tablets, and then on top of it, they're wearing masks all the time. I'm worried if we're raising a generation of what will eventually be like sociopaths or something that have no ability to connect with other people, no ability to read facial cues or social cues at all, no ability to read it, lacking emotion, the ability to read emotion from another human being, because they're engaging online or behind masks. And so I'm really worried about our future when we're old, who the people will be that are running the country, and whether or not they can actually connect and understand emotionally. That is one of my concerns. Yeah,
I absolutely share that concern, and whether they have like an unhealthy deference to government authority. Right. Again, I think all three of us think there are a lot of circumstances where skepticism, just in general, of what the official line is warranted. And so I'm worried about an overly, deferential generation. Anyway, more rising right after this.